Living a life in full is a conversation you always wanted to have with that person who gave an amazing TED Talk, or the author of one of your favorite books, or that inspirational Olympian you always wanted to know more about. It's graduate-level conversations with those making a difference in the world and in the lives of others. This show brings you new ideas and approaches so that you can live a life in full. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Stout, and I hope you enjoy this episode. This episode is brought to you by the nonprofit I founded, the Center for Global Initiatives. The Center is an all-volunteer organization, so there are no salaries, and thus all tax-deductible donations can go to the work. While our key country partner is in Tanzania, our work is global and generally focused in the areas of education and healthcare. We also help others to get their nonprofits started or augment others' project-based initiatives. It's our goal to open source humanitarian intervention and to help make it easier for others to do more good in the world. We are proud to have been ranked a great nonprofit every year since 2011 and to have achieved a platinum-level rating by GuideStar. Links in this episode's show notes will take you to published articles on our outcomes, a number of helpful tools, and downloadable resources, which are all free, always. Please visit us at centerforglobalinitiatives.org and be sure to watch our video at patreon.com/Dr. Chris Stout to learn more. Thanks. Welcome to another episode of Living a Life in Full. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Stout. I'm happy to welcome Paul Ronto to the show. He's the Director of Digital Content and Chief Marketing Officer at RunRepeat in Fort Collins, Colorado, the world's largest athletic footwear review site. He's also a hiking expert, ultramarathoner, and adventurer. In the last 20 years, Paul has climbed, hiked, and run all over the world. He's summited peaks throughout the Americas, trekked through Africa, run 6 marathons, and also competed in 24-hour trail races. Additionally, he has worked in the outdoor industry as a whitewater and hunting guide, gear tester, copywriter, and outfitting specialist at Knowles, the National Outdoor Leadership School, which is awesome if you're not familiar with it, as well as No Barriers USA and Sierra Trading Post. He's been quoted in New York Magazine, NBC News, and Business Insider, to just name a few. His industry expertise includes work with hyper-growth stage software-as-a-service startups, nonprofits, $20 billion multinational companies, and a number of small and mid-sized businesses across the nation. He's also a fellow data-wonk. He's part of the recently released report, The State of Ultra Running 2020, which we'll be discussing and doing a very deep dive on in today's show. And it was produced by RunRepeat and the International Association of Ultra Runners. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chris. I'm excited to be here and talk about this study as well as whatever else comes up.
Awesome. Great. It's going to be a great conversation. So before we get into the report, I want to set a little context for the listeners about your company, RunRepeat. In my research of it, it seems like you're a very data-driven organization, and I've read that you have the what I think is the largest database of reviews with over 4 million athletes and 12,000 experts having contributed. So can you tell us about this process? How does it work? How do you get so many contributors?
Yeah, for sure. First off, yes, RunRepeat is a footwear review site. Technically, we're the largest athletic footwear review site on the web. Our interest is to help users find the right footwear for whatever sport they're interested in doing. And we do that in a variety of ways. One way is we aggregate reviews from all over the web. So those tend to be user reviews. And we have a team of writers here at RunRepeat who read through every single review we can find. And then we summarize the pros and the cons of why a piece of footwear or a specific model or a brand might be the right shoe for someone. We take, maybe we'll take 1,000 reviews and we spend over 20 or 30 hours reading all those reviews and boil that down into something the user can really understand in just 30 or 40 seconds.
Wow.
We try to take all that research off the plate of the consumer and get them the information they need that's most important to the purchase they're making. And so that's one part of it. We aggregate reviews. We also have an expert review system where we have users that post reviews on our site, as well as expert testers that we send product to, so they go out and actually use the product extensively and write up an expert review. And so all that review data then eventually gets aggregated into what we call our core score. And our core score is a very simple metric. It's a score between 1 and 100. Obviously, the closer to 100, the higher rated the shoe is. Mm-hmm. And it allows the user very simply to see on that basis from 1 to 100 how high the shoe is scored. And those scores are a weighted average between expert reviews, user reviews, and reviews that we find online. Wow. And then the last piece of our puzzle is we partner with over 250 retailers across the U.S. and internationally as well, to make sure that we can find the exact product the consumer wants, whether it's a color or a specific size, for the best price. And so, we take all the research out of having to then go and find that shoe at a retailer online somewhere. And so it makes the shoe buying process extremely easy, and that's really our main focus, is helping the consumer find the right footwear for whatever sport they're participating in.
That is great, and I remember from looking at your site too. It's obviously the sweet spot is for runners, but you also have like hiking boots and a variety of other kinds of footwear for just about whatever kind of activity. It seems like that's pretty amazing. So it's like almost like a meta-analysis. Then you guys go out and search and scrape and get these things, and then consolidate it all down into the core score. Is that right?
Yeah. Basically, what we're doing is a meta-analysis. Our goal is to find all the information possible on every model of athletic footwear, and then aggregate it into a very simple and understandable format, so that it's easy for the user to pick the right shoe for them.
Gotcha.
You're right. Ultimately, we started as a running-focused company. The name RunRepeat is a misnomer these days, but our founder was a very running-focused guy. And as we've grown into other athletic categories, and the brand has kind of stayed the same as RunRepeat. But you're right, we've got hiking boots, mountaineering shoes, volleyball shoes, soccer cleats, football cleats, baseball shoes. I mean, any athletic footwear you can really imagine needing to purchase for whatever sport you do, we tend to cover.
That's great. I think like Runner's World magazine and stuff like that, I actually still get the print copies and stuff, and it's, I'll go through and, they'll be like, here's the trail running shoes, and here's the this season shoes, and here's the stable shoes, and all that. And it really is sort of an overwhelming process. And then I'll just sort of vet something down. I do like like knowing how much a shoe weighs and those kinds of things, in addition to all the other metrics. But it just, it becomes kind of this, rabbit hole. It's like, oh my God, have I researched everything? Or what if if I missed an issue, or, what have you. So it really is nice that this service that you all, provide for folks or whatever kinds of shoes. And historically, my weakest link was always my feet. I mean, it was, periodically a tweak or a joint issue or something, but, blistering for long distances in particular, and blistering. And that was a problem with climbing boots and hiking boots and, the whole bit. So I tip my hat to your founder and the development of this. It's certainly a wonderful service for those of us that still are always kind of searching for the next best shoe and what works and what doesn't. So maybe that's a good segue over into talking a little bit more about database kinds of things. So you, and I hope I'm going to pronounce her name correctly, so tweak me if I mispronounce, but Vania Nikolova. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah. We call her we call her Vania here.
Vania, okay.
She's one of our data analysts on the team.
Well, she, just to give a little shout out to her in the bio that I found on her, she's got a PhD in mathematical analysis, as well as her, kind of sounds like her sport is obstacle course racing. She had earned the Spartan Trifecta medal, which I've done a few like Tough Mudders and stuff like that. So I think my son still has like a barbed wire ripped, fire singed singed, shirt or something from one of his races. So she also has over 10 years of experience in weightlifting, martial arts, and nutrition. And her work, published work, she's been on NPR, she's been in the Washington Post, in Shape Magazine, Prevention Magazine, and many other venues. So the two of you, working with RunRepeat and the IAU, collaborated to then create what I want to talk about with you today, the State of Ultra Running 2020. So first off, is this the first I've heard of anything like this? Is this the first report of its kind?
There's been a few different reports that have tried to understand what's happening in the running world, but there's never been a report this big with this many data points. This report really was a passion piece that came out of a report we did earlier in 2019, which was called The State of Running, where we looked at traditional distance races, 5K, 10K, half marathon, and marathon, and wanted to see what was going on in the world of competitive running. Mm-hmm. That report, obviously the traditional distance races have a much bigger participant base, and that report was based on about 107 million data points. Wow. And so compared to the State of Running, which was just over 5 million data points. And so, it was over 20 times more data for that piece, and we had really good response on it. We partnered with the IAAF, and we're actually the keynote speaker in China last year, talking about the state of running.
Wow.
And so this was a follow-up piece based on some interest that I had as an ultra runner, but also wanted to see what was going on in ultra running. We had continued to hear that ultra running was on this growth trajectory that was very different than traditional distance races. What we discovered in that original piece was that there's actually been a decline in the last couple of years in participation in traditional distance races. And so wanting to understand what's happening in this ultra distance category and why that's still growing at a very healthy rate compared to traditional races, that was kind of the impetus for the study.
Gotcha. So tell me the data, what you're in again. How many million?
So this piece had over 5 million results from just over 15,000 different races over a span of 23 years. We could have gone back a little further, but we figured going back 23 years was enough to get a good snapshot. So, our goal with these pieces is we want to take the 30,000 foot view snapshot of the sport and see what shakes out. Yeah. And so that's where we went with this. And, I think, like I said, it's the biggest study that's been done on ultra running to date, and the results really actually surprised us. We had some expectations, but there were some findings that came out of this that were really interesting that we didn't expect as well. And so that's the fun part about doing these studies, is at the end of the day, learning something that maybe you didn't expect.
Right. Yeah. I always kind of struggle with confirmation bias. As soon as I find what it was I thought I was going to find, it's like, okay, don't rest. Keep looking. But so it's particularly nice when you do find those kinds of those surprises that might cause you to scratch your head and maybe take a look at the data again. So I'm kind of cheating. I have some in my notes, some bullet points about some of the key findings and results, and I thought I might say those out loud for the listeners. They'll be in the show notes and in LinkedIn and some other places that the show is more in written form, so people can see these. They're sort of hard to understand if you're driving in your car and hearing all these numbers. But does that sound good? Is that a good approach? I can hit some bullet highlights, and then you can maybe provide some color commentary to the scores, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Great. Okay. So one of the things that stood out, I think is just fascinating. Talk about clickbait kind of a thing, of something that really attracts your attention, that female ultra runners are faster than male ultra runners. However, and this is where I love your data sophistication, at distances over 195 miles. So you could have, maybe, little snarkily said, oh, women ultra runners are faster. But then you went to the second, took that second step and said, in these kinds of distances. So the data you had said that the female pace was 17:19 minutes a mile, which is 0.6% faster than the male, which was 17:25 minutes a mile. So can you kind of unpack that for us a little bit? So again, I tip my hat to you of like getting into the data so deeply to be able to say, well, this only really occurs when it's over 195 miles, which is nothing to sneeze at. I would imagine your N starts to diminish. The greater the mileage, the lower the runners, but maybe not. So tell us about that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this data point is interesting because we could have ended this analysis at 100 miles.
Sure.
And so at the 100-mile mark, women on average, again, this is an average.
Yeah.
So it's not saying that the top women athletes are faster than the top men athletes. What we're saying is on average, the average pace between women running these distances and men, we see that women are actually faster at this extreme distance of 195 miles. And the way we got to 195 miles was we had continued to see this closure of the gender pace gap. So at 5K, men on average are about 18% faster than women. And then that difference between men and women continues to get smaller and smaller as the distance gets longer. So at marathon distance, it's only about 11% faster men are. And it continues down this trend to the 100-mile mark, which is where we had planned on ending this analysis. At 100 miles, men and women are almost same. Men are just 0.25% faster than women. And so we thought to ourselves, I wonder if we stretch this out further, does there become a point that this trend line actually becomes in favor of women? And that happens at around 195 miles.
Wow.
Now, the unique part about this is, the critic can say, well, that's really extreme. Not a lot of people are running 200-mile races. Mm-hmm. And we agree with that. And so, we wanted to see where this trend line changed, and that's the number. But ultimately, there's some assumptions that can be made with this as well. Obviously, the cohort of women at 195 miles is pretty small. Mm-hmm. The cohort of men is small too, but it's significantly larger than women at those distances. So the women that are running those distances tend to be very elite level. And some of the men, although they're very elite level as well, there's still more participatory signups in the male category, we believe, than in the female category at those distances. And so there are some people that maybe bring down the male average time. And so we really wanted to look at what these numbers look like. So we went one step further even and broke this into quartile breakdown as well as at every 10%. And so what we found was somewhat interesting is at this distance over 195 miles, in the elite, very most elite, the top 25% of those runners, women and men are actually only 1 second apart.
Wow.
And then between the 25 to 50% quartile, men actually do have some advantage. They're about 5 seconds faster than women. And then the second half of that analysis, from 50% up to 100, women do have quite an advantage over men. And so overall, women have this slight advantage, 0.6% faster at 195 miles. But I think the data is just an interesting anecdote to show that at a certain distance, there does become a leveling of the playing field.
Yeah.
And men and women's bodies are really fairly equal to be able to take on these endeavors.
Wow, that is just fascinating. Thank you for kind of giving us how you went through that whole process. That is fantastic. I'm recently joined the faculty at a new university, and I'm going to be in charge of a lot of dissertations. So I'm going to be maybe getting you as a consultant in if we have some big data kinds of things. So I loved your whole thought process with that. So next thing is that, and you kind of made reference to this in terms of people signing up and things along those lines, like that participation, the bullet point, the finding was participation's increased by 345% in the last decade, from around 137,000 and some change to 611,000 folks, and 17.8 times over the last 23 years. So they're like, we're kind of at the zenith at this point of ultra runners. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, there's never been more ultra runners than there are now. I mean, these numbers are still fairly small. I mean, 611 participations around the world in 2018 is still fairly small when you compare it to marathons and half marathons and 5Ks and 10Ks.
Right.
But what's interesting is that ultra running's seen a steady growth pattern for the last 23 years. And the last 10 has been particularly strong, especially when participation in traditional distances has tapered off and even declined in the last few years.
Mm-hmm.
And so, people are interested in this sport. I think there's this idea that after you've done a marathon, there's got to be another challenge out there, or maybe they want a superlative challenge that they can, take that Instagram photo of running a 100-mile race, or something they can brag about to friends. And so I think that there's more people starting to participate in these events that aren't necessarily elite level ultra runners that are doing it because it's a passion. It's maybe someone that wants to try the next thing that's harder than a marathon, or they want to get on the trail instead of the road, and they do a race. And a lot of these, these trail races tend to be ultras. So maybe there's 35K or 50K or whatever it might be. And so I think that there's some interest in people just doing something that's a new experience. Part of this data also found that people tend to travel more for ultra races than any other races. So people are looking at these experiences as something worth traveling to a foreign country for, or going somewhere far and beautiful.
Right.
A lot of these races take place in gorgeous wilderness areas. And so I think there's some motivation behind that to experience this and not just do it for the race.
Yeah, a few things I want to react to with that. I think that is so true. It's my own personal experiences. I mean, I very much enjoyed, I felt running was like one of those few things that was like an athletic activity I could do with my kids. I have a son and a daughter that are both runners, cross country and distance and marathon and whatnot. And they, it was like I could run 5Ks with them, when they were kids, and then we could, do 10Ks or 10 milers or half marathons or whatever. I wouldn't go out and play soccer with my kids, on a soccer team or something. So it's kind of nice that way. And it's also such a nice, a lot of these like starter races and stuff are for a good cause, or they're during a holiday. I've got more turkey trot t-shirts than I can count, kind of a thing with my kids. So, but I think your point is also well taken about distance races. I hope to goodness there's no, I guess maybe Badwater is a lot of on asphalt and melting on asphalt, but it's nice to be in nature. It's nice to be, other than the trip and fall issues with some trails, but there is something very different with a person's mechanics, with a person's experience of being on even if you might suffer with altitude or something, in a high Colorado run, that is just so different than plodding along, in downtown Chicago at a half marathon, or a whatever kind of 5K even at that point. And then your other point, like some of the things I've seen on documentaries of some of these, like I can't remember, I can't name them off the top of my head, but some of these, like there's like a high altitude ultra somewhere in India, that's in the Himalayas. There's some, or Nepal or someplace, and there's some like you probably know these way better than I do, but there's like some like super ultra distances that are all done in deserts, including the traditional, what we think of as like hot deserts, as well as the desert of Antarctica. So, and people try and do all four of those, within the span of a year or a season or what have you. So there's a certain, exoticness, I guess, that goes along with those, those kinds of venues, and adds to the excitement, if not the mystery or the intrigue of those as well.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree. I think that's one of the main factors that's fueling the growth of this sport and the continued interest in it, is that the races are fun. I mean, they're not as focused. I mean, there's obviously people that want to win these races, but a lot of these races aren't as focused on the competition, and they're more focused on the experience. I mean, a lot of these races tend to have average paces that look very close to walking. I mean, an average pace of 15 to 20 minutes per mile, even though it's on trail and it's uneven terrain, or maybe it's really steep terrain, is still a lot of walking compared to, the performance that you expect at a marathon or a half marathon, where you're looking at people who are running. I mean, with these elite level athletes, they're running under 5 minute miles for a marathon. And so being able to compete in a marathon with those people who are running 4.5 minute miles is a really tall order. Even trying to compete in a marathon with someone running 7 minute miles is a feat that is superhuman. But being able to sign up for one of these ultra races and say, you know what, I can walk when I need to. I can take 20 minutes off at the aid station and lay down. I can eat a piece of pizza.
Right.
They're just a little bit more accessible, even though the distances seem unfathomable. It's like this is more of a community than competition, and I think that drives some of the participation in these events.
Yeah, I did my first organized ultra distance, thing. I hate to call it a race or a competition. Was the Chicago 50-50, and it was along the Chicago lakefront. And you sort of had this option: you could either be on an asphalt trail, which was there, or like a lot of other people, not just the runners, there was grass to the side, and you could kind of give your legs and feet a little bit of a break with that. And it was probably the least competitive, quote unquote race that I've ever been a part of. I mean, whoever's like around you, like checks in with you, hey, how you doing? Or says something supportive. And then you find yourself starting doing that with others. I mean, people do that in marathons and stuff, as well too, and 5Ks, of course, but there's just, I can't quite find the words to describe it, but there is something that is just qualitatively different on a trail run or on an ultra run that that you just don't necessarily see in it. I think you use the proper word, community. There's just sort of like this communal feel that if someone tweaks something or gets hurt, someone's gonna stop. They're not gonna like just say, "Oh, tough stuff, pal." So it's a very interesting phenomenon that way. So, all right. Well, let me get back to we'll go qualitative, quantitative. So participants, in terms of women's involvement, that 23% of participants are female compared to just 14%, maybe back in the early days, 23 years ago. So, thoughts on that? Any assumptions as to other than what we've already kind of talked about? But do you have any other thoughts about the increase of women getting involved?
Yeah, I mean. Again, there's never been more women in ultra running than there are now. It's still a really low percentage. I mean, when you compare it to marathons and half marathons and traditional distances where you're seeing over 50%, 60% women, more women participants than men in some traditional distances. So 23% is still a really low number, but it's the highest it's ever been. And so I think that's interesting. More women are getting involved in endurance sports. I think more women are starting to understand that they're really built for this. It's not a man's sport.
Yeah.
There's a lot of articles out there about the physiology behind why women are better at endurance sports than men. And there's a lot of data that supports it, that, women have more fat in their body, which is a longer burning fuel source than men. Women are mentally tougher. There's a bunch of studies that have been done recently on the mental fortitude of women, and that really goes into this. I think there's less ego in women, and again, running an endurance race is about the mindset. And so, I think that there's some really interesting reasons why women are suited for this kind of sport. But also, I think, women are starting to have more interest in it when they see other women doing it.
Sure.
I think that this trend will continue to happen as more women help get other women involved in the sport. And on honestly, pieces like this that really show that women are on an even playing field with men, I think is a motivator as well, to show that they can really compete at an elite level and not just against the other women.
Yeah, it's an interesting, it kind of raises a cause and effect thing of what we were just talking about with the sense of community, and do more women get drawn in because they have a sense of community with it and that's appealing, or do we have more sense of a community because more women are involved in it, so it's an interesting sociological as well as physiological kind of perspective. I had Alex Hutchinson on a few episodes back, who wrote a fantastic book called Endure, wherein he talks a lot about he talked about the breaking the 2-hour marathon and Kipchoge, and he talks about ultra distance runners and other kinds of endurance athletes and stuff, and raises some of those same kind of physiological, psychological kinds of aspects to it as well. So it's nice to counterbalance that with some good epidemiological kinds of data that you guys have compiled. So, and interesting, again, kind of a clickbait, interesting kind of headline is that you also found that ultra runners have never been slower across distance, gender, and age group. In 96, the minute per mile was running around 11:35, and in more recent, you found it's increased to 13:16 as an average minute per mile or minute mile. So, do you think that's because of more trails, more involvement, or what are your theories and theses on that?
Well, there's a couple of assumptions here. And again, this trend is also seen at traditional distance races. Over the past few years, runners have honestly never been slower. I think part of this goes back to more people are signing up for these events to participate rather than compete.
Yeah.
And so there's more amateurs, I think, doing these kind of races than just elite level professional athletes that are getting paid. There's also this idea that, again, it's not for the competition, it's for the experience. And so some people, I think the average runner is out there doing it for enjoyment.
Yeah.
And so maybe they're not focused on their pace. Also, more people are doing it. And when more people do anything, there tend to be more people in the middle than at the elite level. And so as participation increases in any sport, there's going to be metrics of performance are going to come down somewhat. And again, I want people listening to understand, we're not saying that the elite pros are slower. Obviously, those people who are getting paid to run and have new technology and are innovating and training hard, their times are getting faster, just like we saw with the 2-hour marathon being broken.
Right.
But what we're saying is the average runner is getting slower. And I think a lot of that really has to do with more participation and more people participating in a participatory mindset. And so, what's interesting though is, again, it's like we're seeing amateurs and everyday athletes signing up for these events that 15 years ago maybe were thought really fringe and, gosh, I can't run a 50-mile race or a 100-mile race. Now it's something that's more accessible, and it's like, I ran a half marathon, maybe I'll try a 50. And so that's like a really big mindset jump to be able to even take that on. And I think that's what's exciting is once you get more everyday athletes involved in a sport like this, it's when it can really set on fire. It's not just for those elites anymore.
Yeah. I feel like probably another answer to the question of slower is because of me. I feel like I'm personally responsible for dragging down the average time.
Me too. 100%. I'm on the same boat.
I don't know, man. So I think, also there's the aspect of I finished a 30 miler, a 50 miler, a 50K or whatever, rather than I won, Badwater or something. So I, and I'm old enough to know that that's how marathons used to be. 30 years ago, if you finished a marathon, it's like you summited Everest or something. It was sort of like, wow, really? And how things have changed, from nutrition and exercise and training clubs and groups and obviously, as shoes and equipment and things like that. So that's very cool. So you also
on that point, Chris, I think you're right. I think when people talk about marathons, it's not I finished anymore. It's I ran it under 4 hours, or I qualified for Boston, or whatever their goal is. The goal seems to not be the finish anymore. It seems to be a time. And I think ultra marathons are not there yet. They haven't seen a time. They're still the I finished is the goal. And I think that is a large part of the mindset that goes into ultra running, that it really is about the experience is the journey, and it's not the time that you're finishing this race in. And so I think that that's a really interesting psychology behind the people that are doing these races compared to people that are maybe still doing half marathons and marathons, and they're really focused on that performance aspect of it.
Yeah, well, point well taken. Yeah, that's good. And I think that is good. If people also, because things happen. I mean, sometimes like early on in a race or a run, even just training, it's going to be a good day or a bad day. And sometimes you tweak something, you go, okay, well, this is dumb. If I'm going to continue to do this, I'm going to inflame the problem and mess myself up for my race next month or something. So I think there's also maybe a little bit when you don't have that elite level, I'm doing this as my job, this is the key, I'm an Olympic level, or I'm a whatever level of whatever it is that I'm doing. people, I think, can cut themselves a little slack and not have that balance of being able to return to run and do things at a level that is less, I guess, in a sense, less competitive, like we've talked about, and more rational, and I think really psychologically healthier as well too. So
I
thank
100% agree with that. I mean, I think the psychology behind why people do races at all, I think, is a really interesting question. And, in a life where we're inundated with stress and technology and screens and never ending performance at work, it's like, are we doing these runs because we want more stress and we're focused on a number, or are we doing these runs to relax? Are we doing these events to get away and disconnect and reconnect with nature and being outside? And so I like the aspect of it that it's about finishing and not about a time, because it really changes the whole mindset of training. It changes the mindset of race day, and it becomes more about the experience and the community than it does about your personal performance and that time that maybe you don't hit, and then are you disappointed, and now you got to do another one, and like it's like a rabbit hole that I think that if you're focused so much on some sort of KPI, it's like, this is running, this is for fun, this is supposed to be enjoyable. We shouldn't turn it into some metric-driven thing that every day we're focused on what our watch says and what the Garmin says and where our GPS is taking us and how many feet in elevation we ran or whatever the metric is. And it's like, why don't we just go outside and try to enjoy it a little? And I like that about trail running. I like that about the ultra community. And obviously there's people in the ultra community that look at it as very high performance, but I think we're seeing more people get into it that aren't as focused on that.
Yeah, that's a point well taken again. So, back to some stats. Runners improve their pace in their first 20 races, and then the pace tends to stabilize out from that. So as people get more into it, they start to have better improvement. Their endurance increases and their speed increases. Or what do you think about that?
Yeah, so like anything, I think ultra running takes experience to get good at it. I think it's very different than running a 5K or a 10K, where your focus is longevity and not technically maybe pace per mile. And so I think that there's some things that happen as people get more of these under their belt, that they learn how to fuel better, what to eat, what not to eat, learn how to utilize their aid stations and their rest stops. It's more than just getting faster every time. It's really about being efficient and how you can go longer rather than faster. And so, maybe that actually means a slower pace than, and you can do that over a longer period of time than a faster pace that you burn out quicker. And so I think that there's a lot of learning, and I think that's why this metric was interesting. It really shows that over time, people get better at the sport, which is to be expected, obviously, but it is interesting. Then at some point, it basically plateaus off, and there isn't much more improvement after you've kind of figured out how to be efficient within these races.
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah, because you do spend that time, for me at least, and maybe this generalizes to others, I spend that time really kind of paying attention to what's going on. I mean, there's also times where I feel like it's a very meditative process. Like I have a little, I usually rarely run with my phone, but I do have like this little recorder that I carry that's very light and just slides right in a pocket, because I'll be like, halfway through with my run, short or long, and I'll have a head full of ideas, so I can't write them down. So I just dictate them into my little recorder, and then I write them down once I get home. But I find it I pay attention to my breathing. I pay attention to my heart rate. I pay attention to, all these little things that I have the time to do that, and I have the headspace to do that. And then kind of if everything's running efficiently in my engine, then, I feel like it's almost like this creative, meditative, restorative kind of time too. It's not a grind. Like when I've done like long distance training runs and stuff, I'll tell my wife, I said, it's not like I have to run today. It's that I get to run today. It's a privileged kind of thing to be able to do, and I kind of honor it that way as well too, which is a much different. That to me, that's the non-competitive mindset, at least is how I experience it and express it. So, it's really a horse of a different color, as they say. So,
I agree. I think that there's I mean, we've talked about it already, but I think that it's that non-competitive mindset that you're talking about, that it's a joy. You know, I think these long distance runs can be a lot for people. You know, I think that they can be meditative. I think they can be the disconnect. I think they can be physically challenged. I think they can be mentally challenging. And so I think you get a lot out of a long distance run that maybe you're not getting when you're going to go to the gym and hit the treadmill for 3 miles and try to work on your pace, or you're doing sprint work. You know, it's like you get to be outside. I live in Colorado, and so a lot of my runs, especially my longer ones, take me out into the mountains and on the trails. And so for me, it's cathartic. You know, it's like I get to be out in nature. And you know what? If halfway through I decide I'm going to walk for 10 minutes or I'm going to walk the rest of it, you know, it's like that's completely okay, because again, it's still that experience of me being outside and getting away from my cell phone and getting away from the stress at home. And so it's like, that's what I love the most about doing these longer races, that is you just stop focusing a lot of times on those metrics that I feel like were really important to me when I was running marathons and half marathons and training for those shorter races. I just have I've left the watch behind. I don't even time myself. I just have an idea of where I'm going to go. And if I'm feeling good, maybe I go longer. If I'm not, maybe I cut it off shorter. So it's like, it's very, it changes to how I'm feeling, instead of me feeling like I have to do this in this amount of time and there being stress surrounding it.
Yeah, that's a really good point about the whole thing with the watch too, because my kids, for I don't know if it was Father's Day or birthday or something, got me a T-shirt that said, if you find me laying along the roadside, please turn off my Garmin. and I think it was, you know, because I was, you know, and again, how we started off our conversation, you know, being very data focused and metrics are cool and all that. But you're right. There are those times where it's a different kind of thing, a qualitatively different kind of thing, to just say, I'm not going to wear my watch because I know where I'm running, and I'm not, you know, going to set a PR, and, you know, it's just, I want to, you know, go out and do that. I was training for a 100K this last summer, and I was in this forest preserve, and I started off like super early in the morning, like 4 a.m. kind of a thing, because I needed to get a lot of miles in that day, and I knew I'd be like running literally from dawn to dusk, and it was such a different, wonderful feeling. Like, you know, it's same areas that I'm totally familiar with, but I'd been running, you know, time and time again in the daylight, and different days of the week and different times of the day, but in daylight. And it was just so nice to kind of see, you know, this trail wake up, so to speak, you know, and there's different bird songs during the course of my run, over the course of hours changing, and to see the arc of the sun, you know, going in directions that were different than what they were in the spring when I had started, you know, this training and stuff. And it's just, you know, that you just don't get that with 5K training or something. Maybe you do if you overtrain, but it was just, it is a, almost, not to sound corny, but I mean, just a very, you know, spiritual almost kind of thing, a different kind of, way different kind of vibe than, you know, corralling yourself up in a, you know, in a half marathon thing, you know, in downtown Chicago. So.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's ethereal. I think that I think that you're not wrong to call it spiritual. It's like, I think that there's something that happens when you're out there for these longer distances that, to me, affects a change that is more important than the running itself. And that's what I enjoy the most about it. I mean, it's like, it really is a healing experience to go run for 10 hours and not feel the pressure to do it in some sort of specific way, you know, and that to me it's freedom. It's like, I don't have to do this in a set amount of time. I don't have to do a set course. I can go out there and I can be me and enjoy the experience. And honestly, I think that that's the beauty of endurance sports, is it forces you to get outside of your normal comfort zone, and your brain goes to some new places that you normally don't give it time to go to. And I don't think people allow that time for themselves. You know, people don't read as much. People don't spend time away from technology as much as they used to. And I think by getting into a sport like this, it kind of forces you to have to, because you can't carry all that stuff with you, and you don't want to at some point. And so, I mean, we could go on and on about that. But again, I think that that's the romance behind an ultra race. And again, I think that's also why this sport is seeing more participation. And one stat we don't actually have in the study that we're going to do a follow-up is this metric that we're calling obsession, and which is basically a metric of showing how many people do multiple ultra runs a year compared to how many people do multiple 5Ks or 10Ks or marathons a year.
Mm-hmm.
And ultra runners, actually what we found is ultra runners actually at a significantly higher percentage do more races per year than any other distance. And so there's this obsession with ultra racing. Once you start doing it, that it becomes like a need, and it becomes something that these runners really dig their teeth into and do multiple of these, even more so than people just doing 5Ks. And that, I think, is a really telling metric. When a 5K is something you could do every weekend,
right?
You could do it without really training for the most part. They're cheap. A lot of them are free. And yet people are still doing multiple ultra runs more than people are doing multiple 5Ks in a year.
And that goes.
So I think that's really interesting.
Does that crosscut? That was actually good segue, because that was one of the next things I wanted to ask you about. So do you know if that crosscuts with the ultra, the elite as well as the non-elite runners, or is it just the?
We looked at the cohort overall, so we didn't look at elite versus non-elite. But I mean, just to give you some examples, let me see where I've got this. In 2018, I think it was 41%. Yeah, so in 2018, 41% of participants in ultras ran more than one a year. And in 96, it was only 14%. So the growth of people doing multiple runs a year is really interesting. And then we looked at how many people do more than one race a year, more than two races a year, more than three races a year. So people that did more than two races a year went up from 7% in 96 to almost 25% in 2018. 3 races a year is up to almost 10%, and so on. And these numbers at 5K are slightly under this. 5K is the next most obsessive category. But like at the marathon and half marathon distance, the numbers are significantly smaller. Like less than 15% of people do 2 marathons a year, yet 41% of people are doing more than one ultra race a year. Wow. And so it's really interesting to see that the people that are doing these ultra races are obsessed with them. And that's the word we're using, obsessed. But they obviously find something that they really desire in this. And because of that, they do more than one, more than 2, upwards of 10 races a year. And so it's really, it's interesting, the psychology that's going on in the minds of people that are doing these extremely hard endurance events.
Well, I know you also talk in there about, you have a global database. You've looked at races and countries and stuff everywhere, and you give some stats about, South Africa's got the fastest average pace, followed by Sweden. So it's not warm versus cold because there's two very different ones, although just varying by less than 2 minutes. And then I think Germany was maybe the third fastest. So to your point, also, it's not like there's a 5K, just about probably within an easy drive of Chicago for me, just about any weekend that I want. There's not an ultra within an easy drive of me any weekend I want. So these folks that are doing multiple ones over the course of a calendar year are probably, needing to travel, like further than a car drive, like an airplane ride, or maybe an airplane ride, across a major ocean or something. So any thoughts about like again, just from an armchair perspective of what I see and what I read, documentaries and books and magazines about some of these like races, ultra races, and again, if they're not if they're in nature, then obviously they have to be in a place where that nature and those trails are available, like the Swiss Alps or what have you, places in the UK. But any thoughts about that too with countries and running, and do you know what country has the most ultras in a year or anything? Did you look at those kinds of factors?
Yeah. So first off, pace-wise, one of the things, this stat on who the fastest nations are, I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why South Africa is at the top of this list is they have a very strong ultra racing tradition. They actually have the biggest ultra race in the world called Comrades.
Huh.
Last year, there was over 25,000 people who signed up for it.
Wow.
And this year, they have opened the registration to 27,500.
Wow.
So it is, I mean, it's massive. When you compare that to something like Western States, which is one of the biggest races in the U.S., I think last year had like 700 or 800, or the Badwater or the Hard Rock, I think only had 250 or something like that last year. And these are the races you hear about in the U.S. South Africa's opening up this race this year to 27,000 people.
I am embarrassed. I've never heard of that. Good golly. Wow.
Yeah, it's massive. And then there's other races too. There's the Tour de Mont Blanc that has about 5,000 runners a year. And so some of these countries have traditions in it. I think one of the reasons why South Africa obviously is fastest is we did not separate trail from road ultra races, and that Comrades Marathon is a road ultra. And so paces are expected to be faster on a road ultra than a trail ultra.
Yeah.
It's really hard to separate the two kinds of races. The databases don't tend to tell you if it's trail or road, so you have to go through manually and know whether each race. And with 5 million data points, it's too big of a project.
It takes a while.
And so that data point is a little skewed by South Africa, but I think countries like Sweden and Germany, they've got a lot of wilderness areas. They've got a lot of mountainous land and trails. In Germany's a prime example. They're very close to Switzerland, to France, to Italy. And so with all those nations, there's a strong community of ultra racing and ultra runners. And so it's very easy for someone in Germany to go down to Mont Blanc and race in a race maybe in France, or go down in Switzerland or Austria and do a race. And so there's more accessibility to, I think, some of these countries as well.
Good point.
Which also goes to the idea we talked about a little bit earlier. We do have this stat that more people travel abroad for these ultra races. I mean, over 10%, 10.3% of ultra runners are willing to travel abroad for an ultra race. When you compare this to 5Ks, only 0.2% of people travel abroad for a 5K.
Right.
So I think, again, this goes back to this experience. People are willing to go further for a race. Maybe people are willing to fly to South Africa to do Comrades because it's the biggest race. Maybe people are willing to fly to France and do the Mont Blanc race. I think that there's some of these superlative races that people are willing to travel to because it's also an experience. You get to be in the mountains, or you get to be part of this massive 25,000 person race.
Yeah.
Or you get to go to somewhere really unique, like you mentioned, Antarctica. There's an ultra race down at the South Pole, and or running through the deserts of Morocco. I think that there's some adventure aspect that really makes these races interesting to people. But also, we talked about obsession. If you love to travel and you love adventure, maybe
there's a good
you're into mountaineering, and maybe the next year you do an ultra race in Morocco, and then the next year maybe you trek down to the South Pole, and part of it's organized in some sort of ultra race fashion, so there's some support and you're not just doing it yourself.
Right.
I mean, there are these reasons why people are willing to travel for these races, and I think it's because they're really unique experiences.
That's a great point. Gosh, it's given me the itch. So that's really a good point. Hopefully listeners as well too. So did you do anything to factor in with the database? And maybe, I don't know how, I'm sure different races parse and collect data differently, but like with DNFs, or did you address those, or were they just not even part of the database? Or
so DNFs were cut out of the database.
Okay.
It was really hard to track DNFs, obviously, in regards to pace. A lot of our data is based on pacing, and so in an ultra race, it's hard if someone drops out at mile 60 or mile 80 to really have a reliably recorded time of when they stopped or where they stopped. And so it would be really difficult to add DNFs as far as pace goes.
Yeah.
And so we had cut DNFs out of the database to start.
That makes sense, yeah, because it'd be an interesting sort of like case study or something like that to see, is there a certain point, or I know that there, again, people talk about the in marathons like hitting the proverbial wall, or Heartbreak Hill in Boston. There might be certain areas that are a little more tricky or treacherous, and that compounded by the fact that someone's been running for the last 10 hours when they hit it, and I could see as being kind of crazy. So
I'm going to make a note of this, Chris. I think that this is actually really interesting, and maybe do an analysis of which race distance has the most DNFs.
DNFs,
And
yeah.
I have an assumption that we'll be surprised that it isn't ultras, but I don't want to put any money on that. But I assume that maybe more people drop out of marathons than they do ultras. And again, I think it goes back to maybe this mindset, and it's a participation and not based on this need to hit a certain time. But I think that would be really interesting. And so I'm going to do some research on that, and I'll follow up with you when we have some numbers. But
good.
I think that would be really interesting to see which category races, or maybe even we open it up to multiple sports, and which activities have most people that drop out. If there's a way to better track that somehow, I think it'd be interesting.
That would, yeah. Well, cool. Yeah, keep me posted. We'll keep our listeners up to date with those kinds of things as well too. So, I want to thank you for being so generous with your time. I don't want to take all day, but I could do like probably a 5-part episode, 5-hour-long episodes with you. So for folks that maybe have kind of been stimulated by our conversation and would really like to, see some of the, and I also should say, I should have said this in the beginning, I apologize, that your graphics and the data representation, not just the work that you did, but also the way that you communicated in the report, kudos. It's really terrific. It's sort of again, I've tried to. It's one thing to be able to have reports, and it's always nice to pull stuff out of tables and give it more graphical oomph and easier reader and user understanding of it. So I think your report has definitely done that. So if listeners want to learn more about you or your company or get a copy of the report, what are the best ways for them to be able to do any of that?
Sure. Yeah. Check us out, RunRepeat.com. Obviously check us out for some of our reports. If you go to runrepeat.com/news, you'll see all of our studies and reports that we published. This report is at runrepeat.com/state of ultra running, and that's state-of-ultra running. But if you just search RunRepeat state of ultra running in Google, you should be able to find it pretty easily. We'd love feedback. My email is at the bottom of this post. You can reach out to me personally. We try to make these studies accessible to the public, so we don't fill them with, all sorts of academic type of statistical analysis. I did my master's degree here at Colorado State University, and the things I wrote back then probably are ineligible for me to actually even comprehend anymore. And so we want to make these studies interesting to everyone reading them, not only the data-wonks and the people that are really data-minded, but also just, your everyday reader. And so we try to make it simple while also as in-depth as possible. And so, yeah, check out the study. Go back and check out the state of running if you're interested in more traditional distance races as well. And let us know what your thoughts are. I'd love to chat with you and go over any of these findings if you're interested in them.
That's great. I really appreciate your openness to that, Paul. Openness in the sense of having done this, because I think it's really honestly a public service. It's fascinating. I think even if you're not like if listeners aren't as nerdy and geeky as I am, or maybe as you are as well, it's still a fascinating report to be able to take a look at, and I just found it very compelling, and again a tip of the hat to the yeoman's work that you and your colleagues did to put it together. I am blown away by the sheer vast amount of data, the proverbial drinking from the fire hydrant, and how you've been able to distill it, make sense of it, use good graphical representations of the data. Just it's not anything I've ever seen, and certainly in the running arena and the ultra in particular. So Is there going to be a State of Ultra running 2021, or kind of what's next in the world of data analytics or data athletics? I think we should coin that phrase. So, what's next on your horizon? Are you just taking a breather and running, or anything else with
I think that those are all great questions. Who knows what the next one is? I mean, we'd like to do a state of triathlon and see what's going on in triathlon.
Okay.
Obviously, I think we'll update State of Ultra as additional years of data come in to see if these trends are continuing. We're actually, we just hired a few more data analysts on the team, so we can continue to do this kind of work. I really appreciate the gratitude for this piece. I mean, this piece took us about 5 months, and like you said, drinking from the fire hose. I mean, there's a lot of data we didn't include in this that we have just because it was so overwhelming. We had to end at some point and figure out what our core key findings are. I mean, we ended up with, I don't know, 10, 12 key findings, and so we could have had 20 or 30 key findings. And I think it's awesome that at RunRepeat we have the ability to do this. We have the freedom to look into the sports we're passionate about, and take the time that it demands to do these analyses well. And I think what's coming next is, like I said, state of triathlon possibly. The Olympics are coming up, and so I think we're interested in a lot of Olympic type of analysis on the sports that we'll be watching come July. Obviously, we're interested in some social aspects as well. We're doing a piece right now on racism in football. So racism in not in American football, but racism in soccer and football around the world.
Wow.
And what that looks like. And we're interested in some of these social aspects. We just published a piece on Russian doping in track and field events. And so we're going to possibly do a piece on American doping issues in track and field and a comparison of Russia and America. And so we're kind of all over the place. We've got a team of about 6 or 7 of us on this project to do these data type pieces. And we're growing that team in 2020 to add a few more people. And I'm really excited to see what the team's coming up with. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. I think as if you start following RunRepeat now, I think you'll see more and more of these types of pieces coming out that have some really interesting findings that have to do with sport, but also society and psychology and larger issues that interest us here.
That's great. I mean, to shift gears out of running for a second, there is very much a politicalization, obviously, of like the Olympics, and state pride, so to speak, and those kinds of things. But then also, when you think about what oftentimes professional athletes in sports like American football, the NFL, or basketball, representing social issues, on the field or on the court, sometimes in ways, that are, quite provocative and very newsworthy. So I tip my hat to you again. The whole racism and football, soccer is a fascinating thing. So we should, I presume that you and I are going to be, becoming BFFs, very shortly after this. But, I have some students that might be able to, get some dissertation work collaboratively with you as well,
Sure.
too. So
yeah, send them our way. I've been through those programs as well, and maybe I can glean something from them. And again, it's been a while since I've been in an academic setting, but I think it's always good to work with those people that are really interested and passionate enough to be educating themselves and doing these in-depth academic studies. One thing, if there's people out there that are interested in the NBA, we've got an amazing NBA basketball writer on our team that has done a lot of analysis of height evolution and salary evolution of the NBA, as well as, issues that have to go on with, the Euro League versus the NBA. And so we're kind of covering most sports right now. And, if you're someone out there that loves data and has an interesting idea, I'd love to hear from you and see if it can work in our schedule to look at the sport that you're most interested in.
Great, good. Well, thank you for that offer. I suspect that you will have some folks getting your email. I'll put this in the show notes and as well, make it easier for folks as well too. So, well, Paul, again, thank you so much for your time today. I've so enjoyed our conversation and look forward to updates, and we'll post those on our website and social media as well too, as you have new things coming out, new reports as well too, and we can, have you back and do a round 2 on some of the new findings you have with the new studies that you're involved with.
Of course, yeah. I'm happy to come back. And appreciate it. Thanks to all the listeners out there. I know we maybe went over a little bit on time, but I think it was a fun conversation, and I'd love to chat with you again sometime, Chris.
That's great. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much, Paul.
All right, we'll talk to you soon.
Living a Life in Full is a production of Stout Media, a subsidiary of Gordian Knot, LLC. Assistant producer, Gracie Wong. Music, Dan O'Brien. Executive producer and host, Dr. Chris Stout. To learn more, stop by our website, A Life in Full, for show notes. And please recommend us to your friends and subscribe on your favorite platform. And as for the obligatory disclaimer, this podcast is for general information uses only and does not constitute the practice of psychology, medicine, nutrition, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical or psychological advice. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, I take conflicts of interest seriously. For all of my disclosures as well as show notes, please see livingalifeinfull.org/podcast and my LinkedIn profile. Thanks, and until next time.